Rome happens. They did create a common market. We then sought to apply. De Gaulle, who had no love for Britain, that was a true love-hate relationship, all kinds of psychological as well as political reasons. He then vetoed our application twice, once with Harold Macmillan in the early 1960s, and then again with Harold Wilson in the late 1960s. And we didn't end up getting in until the mid-1970s. But even then, it was half in, half out. The Labour Party unfortunately split on the issue. There was then a referendum. The referendum was very, very finely balanced until about a week before, when it suddenly swung to remain with the equivalent of Project Fear then worked. Then this real fear as to what would happen to British jobs and British exports if we didn't join. So there was a 2-to-1 majority, but it didn't really settle the question. Our party, the Labour Party, then oddly, in response to a referendum which voted 2-to-1 to stay in, moved decisively against being in. And in the as late as 1983, our policy was to leave the EU because it was a capitalist club and it was working against the interests of workers and employment and so on, which was certainly not true then, but became progressively more obviously untrue, particularly as it developed into being essentially a club of democracies across Europe, which is what happened increasingly from the 1980s, as you had first Greece, which had been liberated from the colonels, then Spain liberated from Franco, and Portugal all coming in. And then after 1989, most obviously of all, when you had the Soviet Union, which collapsed, and the first thing that all of the newly freed democracies of Central and Eastern Europe wanted to do, they wanted to come into two institutions over and above all, the European Union and NATO, and one to safeguard their prosperity, the other to safeguard their security, and the two coming together. So as that developed, it became clearer and clearer that our future lay in Europe. But that brings us, as it were, to the most immediately relevant history of Brexit and why we're in this mess, which goes back, like so much in British politics at the moment, to the most dominant political leader we've had in this country since Winston Churchill, who was, of course, Margaret Thatcher. And Thatcher was very, very ambivalent about Europe and the EU. She was ambivalent psychologically for interesting reasons. Charles Moore's biography of her, which is brilliant for understanding her makeup and her operation as a politician, she had a virulent psychological and cultural dislike of continentals. She didn't speak any European language. She wasn't part of the war generation that fought in the war, almost all of whom were strongly in favour of going into Europe. She was a woman who never left the country. She never left the country at all until her honeymoon, which was the first time she went to Paris. She didn't visit Germany at all until she became leader of the opposition in the mid-1970s. And she had a virulent anti-German sentiment, which was a sort of classic wartime sentiment for people who never actually met any Germans much, apart from a few prisoners of war, and the attitudes that they adopted in the early mid-1940s. When she'd been a student, well, first of all, she'd been growing up in Grantham and then a student at Oxford. And that never left her, that view. Her last big political act, actually her last two big political acts as Prime Minister, one was to try and introduce the poll tax, which was probably the proximate cause of her downfall. I mean, the most catastrophic thing a British government has tried to do since the war, I would guess, until Brexit. But the second thing she tried to do, which was crucial to her losing the support of sensible pro-Europeans in the Conservative Party, is, remember, she tried to prevent the reunification of Germany. And the reason she tried to prevent it very hard as well. Diplomatically, she sought to prevent it. She sought to keep two German states in existence. She sought to block the negotiations that led to the creation of a united Germany in 1990. And the reason she did was still a very wartime view of a kind of semi-Nazi Germany that was sort of waiting to come out again at a moment's notice. I mean, an extraordinarily backward view, which I think could be partly explained for cultural and reason and factors to do with her age and time. So she'd always been ambivalent about Europe, but what tilted her over the balance between being pragmatically in favour, which is of course where most Conservatives, indeed most Social Democrats were in the early to mid 1980s, to being against, was the appointment as President of the European Commission of a guy called Jacques Delors. Do you remember Jacques Delors? Who had been Mitterrand's socialist finance minister in France in the early 1980s, and becomes President of the European Commission in 1985. And what he seeks to do which completely answers the concerns which historically the left had about Europe, is to put alongside a Europe of integrated markets, the customs union and what was becoming in the 1980s the single market, which was aligning standards and regulatory standards and all that, so you can sell goods much more easily, not just a question of not having tariffs, but actually making it positively easy to produce goods in different countries and trade them across, which Margaret Thatcher had been keen on, because she liked the Europe of markets. But what Jacques Delors seeks to do when he becomes president of the European Commission is to put together alongside the Europe of markets what he calls a social Europe, and what we would now call a social and environmental Europe, which is a Europe which also seeks to raise and, where necessary, in order to ensure effective common action, to harmonise standards of worker protection and environmental standards. You know, things like paid holidays, the Working Time Directive, all of the environmental directives, many of which have had a huge impact on raising quality of environmental standards here, and what's now become the European emissions trading scheme, and all of those things. And the final straw for Margaret Thatcher is when, because she'd been resisting all of this all the way through, resisting all of the moves towards the social Europe. She didn't want Jacques Delors to become president of the Commission, and she was arguing against all of the regulatory changes as well. But then in 1988, when she's already feeling embattled on other fronts too, Jacques Delors in September 1988 comes and addresses the TUC conference in Bournemouth, ironically, True Bournemouth. But he comes and addresses the TUC conference on the theme of social Europe. And she took this personally as if he'd literally come to Britain to attack her and all that Thatcherism stood for and all of that. And 2 weeks later, she made probably the most famous speech of her premiership, probably, the Bruges speech, which was essentially a reply to Delors, arguing we do not need a social Europe. And indeed, if the price of having a Europe of which works together in terms of customs and markets, is we've got to have all of this, as she saw it, Marxism coming in through the back door. I mean, it wasn't particularly Marxism, it was sort of mainstream social democracy, but that's how she saw it. Then we were better off not having it at all. And in the most famous section of her speech, she said, we have not dismantled the frontiers of the state here in Britain only to have them erected with a new vengeance in Brussels. And that she completely flipped. From that moment on, she saw the EU under Jacques Delors and others as a kind of communist enterprise almost, which had to be opposed because otherwise it would prevent the implementation of Thatcherism. And she, of course, always saw Thatcherism as having a lot further to go. Hence the poll tax, hence her designs on privatising the NHS, a whole lot of things that she wanted to do, which, in her view, was still unfinished business. And that is really where modern Brexit, which was called Euroscepticism there, but has become Brexit since, that's where it started from. And that is why it is so overwhelmingly a project of the right, because it's unusual for the right to separate itself from the business interest, which has always been all the way through this overwhelmingly in favour of staying in the EU, because it creates larger markets, and though they haven't always liked the environmental and the social protection, they've understood that they have to swallow that if they're going to be able to take advantage of all the business opportunities. But what the Thatcherites have always wanted to do, for reasons of ideology, thinking that they know the interests of business better than business knows it itself, which is often a view of ideologues, is to see through withdrawal from the EU, partly because there's always been a nationalist argument against it, but overwhelmingly because what they want to see is another dose of Thatcherism. And the cat really came out of the bag in a very hubristic phase after the 2016 referendum, when the Brexiters were crowing about their success in having now finally wrenched us out of this Marxist project, when Nigel Lawson, who had been Thatcher's privatiser-in-chief and her chancellor most of the way through the 80s, and who then also very significantly, because these movements have tended to go side and side, became a climate change denier, because climate change was another communist plot to regulate the economy against it. I mean, it's all part of one world view. Lawson, in a famous article in the Financial Times the week after the 2016 referendum, said, Brexit gives us the chance to complete the Thatcher revolution. That is what this has always been about. That is also why, by the way, why it's so utterly illogical, incorrect, and in my view, self-mutilating for the left to have anything to do with Brexit. Because there's nothing left-wing about wrenching ourselves out of out of the club of West European, European, not just West European, European democracies, which has done more to foster common labour, environmental protection and trading standards than anything that's happened before, and of course to safeguard peace. And peace is, if ever there's the brotherhood of humankind, if ever there's been a more fundamental left value than that, I don't know what it is. So what begins in 1988 as Euroscepticism and wanting to constantly stop any further move towards European integration, which is where Thatcher is, becomes, by a process of attrition over the next 30 years, over the next 20 years, Brexit, you have the referendum party, you have Farage on manoeuvres, who first gets elected to the European Parliament 20 years ago. The referendum party morphs into UKIP. More and more Conservatives become Eurosceptic. David Cameron himself describes himself as a Eurosceptic. Indeed, he's as close as it could be, as it would be possible to being a Brexiter, whilst not actually being in favour of Brexit, which is the position he adopts as Conservative leader. And then, of course, when UKIP starts really increasing in support after 2010, what does he do? Thinking that he can buy time, he agrees to the referendum. And then his bluff is called, he has to hold the referendum, and you all know the history. So that is the history, the long-term history of Brexit. It is partly a psychological position for us as a country of being half in, half out, never having been invaded, being semi-detached from the continent and all that, but that alone wouldn't have done it. That was always a minority argument against Europe. The thing that turned it into a majority argument is it became the major project of the nationalist right, courtesy of Margaret Thatcher and Nigel Farage. That's what happened. Plus massive political misjudgments, massive, by David Cameron, who thought that he'd be able to hold this referendum and win it. He thought that the moral of the Scottish referendum is that flying by the seat of his pants he'd be able to get through it. Actually, what I thought at the time was if we can only hold the union between England and Scotland together by 10%, then I was at that moment very, very worried about the EU, because the arguments for maintaining the United Kingdom are much, much more immediately compelling than maintaining the European Union. So at that point, immediately, I was deeply concerned. But he was blasé. Let's be absolutely frank about it. Labour, we didn't play a great hand in the referendum 3 years ago. We were largely AWOL. Now, I don't actually think that we should beat ourselves up about it too much. We didn't call the referendum. Ed Miliband, I think the single best decision he took as leader of the Labour Party, he didn't go along with the referendum. He never supported it. He was under huge pressure for Labour to support it. He never did. So we actually have remarkably clean hands on the referendum. The worst you could say about us is that Jeremy only made one speech and didn't go around the country campaigning. Now, actually, Jeremy, I can understand it. I wouldn't myself have appeared on a platform with David Cameron at the time.
Can I just make one point? I'm really sorry, but I have to interject that. I run an international IT business. I've spoken to representatives of many European states, including some of the diplomats who are actually running Brexit for their countries, actually dealing with the aftermath. And they have a common phrase, amongst many other things, but ABC, anything but, or anyone but Corbyn. And I hate to say this, but you have it wrong. We have blood on our hands.
Well, but this is a point. There are different points of view. You have that point of view. If we had campaigned forthright for Remain, we as a party, it might have made a difference. I'm not sure. But the point I was making wasn't that we should have done more. If I had been leader of the Labour Party, I would have done more. My point is we do not in any way have lead responsibility for what happened. We didn't call the referendum. Brexit it wasn't a Labour ideology or policy. It had been consistently been a Tory one. Jeremy, because you see, it's important to be frank and honest about this. Jeremy is probably a Brexiter. He comes from a tradition in the Labour Party, which for perfectly honourable reasons, I disagree with it, but it's a perfectly honourable set of reasons, was in the mid-1970s opposed, as you were saying. I mean, there were very good arguments against it in the 1970s. Actually, one reading of Jeremy's position is that he moved, in order to keep the Labour Party together, he moved his position quite decisively. Actually, he moved from himself being pretty much a Brexiter to being prepared to go along with the mainstream view. And if our view was we weren't prepared to have a leader who was basically a kind of just about in favour of Remain, but only just, what we should have done, of course, was to replace the leader. But we didn't do that, so we knew nobody could have been in any doubt what Jeremy's position. I mean, I know Jeremy well. I used to be, before I moved into the hallowed pastures of your constituency, I was in Islington North. So I've never been in any doubt where Jeremy is on Europe. So my only point I make to you is that we're not the ones who responsible for Brexit. The people who were responsible for Brexit were the authors of Brexit, which was David Cameron and a tradition of Euroscepticism going back to Margaret Thatcher. The Tories having got us into this mess, we could and still can do more to get us out of it. And that's where I want to end in my remarks, because where are we now? Where we are now, after 3 years of this total nightmare, is that Theresa May's Brexit is pretty much dead. What she sought to do was to define a Brexit which meant leaving the customs union, the single market, all of the economic institutions of the EU, and indeed all the political ones too, and then seeking to get a free trade deal of some kind afterwards. But of course that would take years to negotiate. You know, I don't know if you noticed, but the EU has just concluded a free trade deal with most of South America, which is hugely big and important. That was signed on Friday. That had been in negotiation for 20 years and 39 rounds of talks. That's how long these things take. So the idea that we were ever, do you remember Liam Fox, the easiest trade deal in history, which was going to be signed a minute after midnight when we left, that was always pie in the sky and total fantasy. It was always obviously going to be that. But anyway, that once she set out her stall as being leaving the customs union, leaving the single market, leaving all the political institutions of the EU, and hoping for the best in terms of a long-term negotiation. My own view is that it was always going to be unviable, Brexit, except at the cost of massive self-harm. But the thing that really did it for her was Ireland. Because the big problem in Ireland is that whereas you might have been able to go into a kind of no man's land of leaving for an interregnum period called the implementation period, which isn't actually an implementation period, it's not actually implementing anything, it's a negotiation period of what happens after. You could do that in respect of Britain, because if you did it in respect of Britain, we would then, of course, have to make a judgment at the time as to what future relationship we wanted, which would be fought between the political parties, we'd have elections about it and so on. But the problem in Ireland is that what would be unconscionable, as the Republic of Ireland spotted immediately and the EU came to completely back them on, and rightly so in my view, is that any arrangement between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland that did not ultimately lead to complete regulatory alignment, that is, no tariffs, no differences of regulation, and no different immigration systems, would by definition require a hard border. Because the reason why you have borders is precisely because you do need to collect tariffs, you do have different regulatory standards, and you do have different immigration rules. And because of the Good Friday Agreement, which requires there to be an open border without infrastructure on the border or any of that kind, that was simply unconscionable. And the reason why Theresa May couldn't get away with saying, oh, but we can discuss all that later, is what the EU said at the behest of Ireland, and I think again correctly, is, well, that's not good enough. You can't just throw the whole of the future of Ireland into the balance and have massive instability in Ireland on the back of what might happen in only 2 or 3 years' time. So what we require from you, O British government, is an absolute undertaking that whatever happens to these trade talks, whether you end up with a close relationship like a customs union or something which is much more like, remember we were talking about Canada and all of that, which is much more distant, there will not be any new tariff, commercial or immigration controls between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. Hence, because this is I'm simplifying because you don't want me to speak all evening, hence the backstop. And hence the backstop from the moment it was negotiated became the Achilles heel of Brexit for this reason, perfectly simple reason. What the backstop effectively means, to simplify it even more, is that if Britain chooses to really leave the EU, by which I mean really leave the customs union, the single market and all of that, so by acts we actually take ourselves away from it and we do have tariffs and all of that. In that eventuality, Northern Ireland would stay in the EU to all intents and purposes. That's what full regulatory alignment, which is the key phrase in the backstop, that's what it means, is that to all intents and purposes, Northern Ireland would still remain in a full customs union with the EU. It would observe most of the rules of the single market in a dynamic sense, but as they changed, it would change too. And the obvious point, which Tories latched onto quite quickly, is if Northern Ireland is staying in the EU, irrespective of what happens to Great Britain, well, that can only mean one of two things. Either you have to have a whacking great border down the Irish Sea, so to all intents and purposes you get a united Ireland, or, and actually to be absolutely blunt, Boris Johnson, Jacob Rees-Mogg, they're not desperately worried about that. They couldn't give a fig about Ireland. They started calling Ireland and Northern Ireland the tail wagging the dog, which when you think about it is a monstrous thing to say. I mean, particularly given the history of Britain's relations with Ireland. But they weren't really concerned about Ireland. What they were much, much more concerned about was that what the backstop would lead to is the whole of Great Britain being kept in this backstop arrangement too. And so they wouldn't be able to do their beloved Brexit, which is the completion of the Thatcher revolution. So there was perfectly good and rational reasons, and they couldn't explain it completely fully because it was too monstrous, as to why they held out against the backstop and voted against her deal 3 times. But where we are now, with Theresa May now history, and with Boris Johnson, I assume, I mean, I read in the papers, but it looks as if it's going to be him, Prime Minister, in 3 weeks' time, is that the unicorns have come out. I mean, there's a whole field full of unicorns at the moment. Somehow we can have a new form of Brexit negotiated with EU that doesn't have the backstop. We can have creative ambiguity. Did you hear that about whether we're going to pay our debts, the 39 billion that we've agreed to pay the EU? We are still apparently going to have the best trade deal in history quite quickly because Boris's magic is somehow going to ensure that it all happens in a quite short period of time. Now, apparently, did you see this morning, Hunt is going to pay the farmers £15 billion? Well, I mean, he's paying farmers £15 billion. Boris seems to be giving everybody everything. I mean, we've had austerity for 10 years, but it turns out we can pay everybody everything. And it turns out that Jeremy Corbyn's manifesto at the last election was a work of acute conservatism, because he wasn't proposing to spend anything like as much as Boris has already committed himself to, and that's before you get to Jeremy Hunt's 15 billion quid for the farmers and the fishermen and so on. So where we are at the moment is the fantasy is all the stuff that's being said in the Conservative. We've also got this thing about proroguing Parliament. I mean, Parliament has never been prorogued. Proroguing Parliament means the Queen issuing a proclamation forbidding Parliament from meeting. Now, that has not happened at a time of national crisis since the English Civil War. So the idea that the Queen is going to be put in the position of issuing a royal proclamation saying Parliament is not going to meet in September or October before we take the biggest single decision we've taken as a country since May 1940. I mean, that's obviously not happening. It doesn't matter whether you might like it to happen. It doesn't matter whether you're Dominic Raab and if you were dictator of the universe, this is what you would do. It is not happening. There is no way that you're going to get the Cabinet Secretary and the Queen's Private Secretary and all these people agreeing to do such a thing. So what is going to happen is Boris is going to collide with reality. And it's as simple as that. I mean, he would have some Roman metaphor, isn't it? Scylla and Charybdis, whatever is he is going to collide. This is what's going to happen. And the big question in British politics now is what happens when he collides. And there are only, as I see it, unless I've missed something, there are